So, good, evening, afternoon? First of all, I would like to thank a lot to the Global Development Institute, to Thomas Gillespie and all the team, also for the Urban Institute and the Greater Manchester Housing Action for this incredible opportunity to share with you the presentation of my newest book, Urban Warfare, Housing Under the Empire of Finance, which was the result, as Thomas has introduced, of my work as rapporteur, in which a mission here in the UK in 2013 was a very important part of this work and illuminated a lot this book, especially when I was able, including in this city, Manchester, hearing the ones most affected by housing policies reform as part of austerity measures and witness the effects and the impacts of the dismantling of housing as a part of the welfare state. So contrary to what the British Tories believed when I came and present my conclusions after the end of my visit here in 2013, and I was clearly saying that the reforms, and by that time the bedroom tax was on the table and was the topic being discussed, was clearly a regression in the human right to adequate housing, and of course the government was very, very angry about that. And they were clearly saying that my visit was politically motivated, that I was hired by Labour MPs in order to come here and do politics. But my visit here had absolutely nothing to do with that, but was indeed motivated, and that's why I asked as a rapporteur to come to do a mission in the UK. We call, in the system of UN country visits, we call missions. And we, as rapporteurs, are able to do 2 country missions a year throughout our mandates, which are 3 years and can be renewed once, so 6 years in a row. And my last visit was to UK, and the way it works in this system is that we, rapporteurs, ask the countries to invite us to come, and that's exactly what I have done with the British government, which has a standing invitation for any rapporteur to come. So they said, yes, okay, thinking that collaboration with UN is part of the system. And of course, they were not expecting the impact of the visit, but I can tell you the impact by the visit by telling you the story of my first day arriving in the border, in the airport, and showing my Brazilian passport. As always, I had, from the officer sitting there, a lot of questions. What are you doing here? Oh, I came to do a mission. I am a UN Special Rapporteur. And I showed my laissez-passer, my UN laissez-passer, saying, you are rapporteur on what? On adequate housing. Oh, welcome. You don't know what the mess is. And then he started telling what his family was passing through in London with overcrowded conditions and chatting. And that was day 1, and that followed the whole mission, the whole 15 days through. And then my decision to ask to come to UK was informed by a research hypothesis. Yes, I am an academic. I am a professor in urban planning and urban studies in the University of São Paulo, and I have been an academic researcher and professor for all my life, throughout my life, so I couldn't escape of having a research hypothesis throughout my mandate, which is a large-scale narrative about a current global process, which is the radical transformation of the directions of housing policies worldwide, and its failure as an alternative to the provision of adequate housing for all. And this research hypothesis, so this radical transformation from, and globally, housing from being part of the welfare state, from being a human right, from being part of a social policy, into a housing as a commodity or housing as an asset, has to do with a process of what I call in the book financialization of housing, but I would say financialization of urban and built space as a whole. So this idea is that a new colonial empire, and I use the word empire on purpose, it's about territorial and as well as cultural occupation, including force, and eventually police and military force. So this new colonial empire, which, contrary from the old empires that we have, is faceless and flagless, is seizing territories and reshaping cities. And this is global finance. It is a global process, is deterritorialized, is abstract, is fiction, it's speculative because finance is speculative by nature. The nature of finance is to speculate on future value and this is the game. So it's not a deviation of finance. It's the very nature of finance, in which this process of financialization, space or built space, has a key role. And having said that, we are talking about a global process, but like all the other experiences that we had with colonialism, each locality, each country, but eventually each region or city within those countries have a particular unique expression of the process, depending on path-dependent political economies of housing, land, and urban that existed before. We could talk about this as a global process in several ways. We could talk, for instance, like commenting those rent-seeking landscapes of shopping malls, corporate towers, international brands, hotels and cultural centers and museums, which reproduce themselves in different cities everywhere, offering to the surplus of capital which circulates over the planet, and I'm talking about an electronic cloud, we can call it a wall of money, of financial fluxes, and those spaces, rent-seeking spaces, are offered to this cloud to park, and they are real estate homogeneous products which can be priced in the international market. So that helped us to explain, and in the beginning I was thinking, how come in such different cities like Dubai, Chicago, Jakarta, Rio de Janeiro, we see the same corporate towers, the same international brands, the same shopping malls, the same morphology? Is that an epidemic of lack of imagination of architects and planners? No. Those are the morphologies. Those are the products that are clearly identified and priced in the international financial market. So, yes, we could talk much more about them and how much they are taking over our neighborhoods and our community landscapes, but here I want to talk much more about through the lenses of housing policies which actively have created the material, symbolic, and normative conditions for the capture of lived territories, and about the global processes of dispossession that came together with that, interrogating also who and where were the displaced, and of course their forms and tactics of emplacements, which means their resistance to stay put, to stay in place. Throughout, and why housing, and this is the first part of the book, and of course I won't present the whole book because I want you to buy it. So I'm going to present just the first part and some glimpses of the others, but the whole first part is on the results of country missions and also research on housing done during my mandate as Special Rapporteur, where I could witness the effects of the financial crisis of 2008. So the mandate started in 2008, and immediately first thing was the financial crisis, which was clearly a mortgage crisis, which was clearly a housing crisis. And so, first of all, foreclosures and homelessness in US, in Spain, in Ireland, complaints of foreclosures and people that were not able to buy, to stay in the homes that they were buying through mortgages, and homelessness rising in some countries where it was not the case before. And then clearly I did a mission in the US to discover that this whole global process of change really started in the late 70s in US under Ronald Reagan and UK under Margaret Thatcher, and then spread up all over the places. But my second mission was in Kazakhstan, and I went to Kazakhstan not because of the housing crisis, which was the reason why I went to US in the first time, and I arrived in Kazakhstan without knowing much about the country and the human rights situation in the country. And when I arrived there, activists, they invited me to a hunger strike site where people who have been called to put all their savings in newly built apartments built by Turkish construction companies funded by European, mostly German money, and with the financial crisis, those companies went bankrupt and the apartments were not finished, and the people had put all their savings in the apartments, were in the middle of the street without a home and without savings, and they were in a hunger strike trying to press the government in order to do something about that. Then I went to Israel, and of course, when a human rights person goes to Israel, it's caught immediately with the Arab or Palestine and Israel conflict, but, surprise, a camp in Dizengoff Street, the main street of Tel Aviv, of young Israelis asking for reforms in the housing policy because they were not able to live in housing anymore in a country that used to have a very universal housing policy for Israelis, Jews. So, and then again, here the movement anti-bedroom tax. So I was wondering what was the origins of all those crises, and especially crises in countries that were not notable for having housing problems. When I started my mandate in the UN, the common sense there at the Human Rights Council is that adequate housing is a problem of the global south, basically. Latin America, Asia, Africa. In Europe, in North America, the question is more or less solved. And that was exactly what was the common sense. So all of a sudden, a housing crisis, a housing emergency in places that were not, that had not that. So what happened? What happened is the dismantling of housing as a social policy, as a human right, into housing as a commodity and financial asset, which is, again, contrary to the narrative or neoliberal narrative, actively promoted and led by the states and public policy. And more than that, in many, many cases, funded with public money. So the whole narrative that we should get the state out of the business and open the space for the market to get in, because the state is spending too much, because the state is very bureaucrat and it's not providing adequate housing, and we need fresh private money to come and offer these new possibilities for the people to have access to housing. So this was the promise. But the promise, besides of being a failure, and you go, I mean, to any places in Europe or North America that have implemented this policy, and you can see empirically that this is a lie, that the situation, the housing situation, it's not better, it's worse for a lot of people. But more than that, also the idea that states are not spending money, it's another big, big lie. In the case of US, for instance, since the 70s, we really had very, very acute budget cuts in financing public housing, in maintaining the public housing stock, or you had also a lot of cuts in subsidizing housing associations and other non-profit and city council here in the UK, as with the justification that there was no money left to do that. But if you see in the same countries, tax exemptions for home ownership have grown madly. So tax exemptions are public money. So we are not talking about cutting public money into the housing sector. We are talking about changing hands of public money in the housing sector. And there is a lot of public investment. And if you see any public-private partnership, including in this city, Manchester, most of them are being built in council land. So this is public resource. This is public money, which is being privatized and which is being mobilized in order to provide for global capital a place to park. And all this strategies in order to reform housing systems, of course, they were very different from place to place, as I said. And when I talk about global finance, I'm talking about this electronic cloud. I'm talking about sovereign funds, sovereign funds from countries, hedge funds, and equity funds. We are talking about pension funds. Believe me, the most important investor last year in real estate globally was the pension funds of teachers in Texas. And so our money, working class money, which of course all the pension systems were reformed under neoliberalism and they were pushed towards pension funds, and now pension funds need madly an investment that can bring yield in order to provide the pensions for the workers. So basically this is going, and it's a massive amount of money. Also the surplus of corporate money. Just the money of Apple that produces the devices, the mobile phones, which is invested in global finance today, is bigger than the sovereign fund of Germany. So, I mean, we are talking about, and the money of Russian, Chinese, plutocrats, new corporation, we are talking about a massive amount of money, which also because of neoliberal reforms are completely free to move everywhere. But we are talking about also a lot of differences in the system of working that, and part of this difference has to do with the digital revolution. I'll come to that. So, again, the strategies that the governments have done towards offering the housing sector for the financial capital to park were very different. Privatization, right to buy here, was one of the strategies that you are familiar with. Also here, privatization to the city tenants, a very important political measure that in terms of UK politics. Also privatization after the Berlin Wall of all the Eastern European stock. Sometimes it's not privatization, but financialization of housing providers. So this happened a lot, for instance, in Germany, in Sweden, in the Netherlands, where housing providers were pushed towards the market in order to get funds to continue working. And it's very, very easy and easy to understand. The capital invested in some place, which is parking in some place, needs to have and seeks to have high returns. And in order to have high returns, it's very important to extract value from that particular place. And that means the extraction of value means in many, many cases, and it's the case, for instance, where housing providers became financialized, raising in rents, and more people being unable to pay those rents anymore. So this is one of the forms where this happened in different countries. But also, we had financialization in the Global South. It's not just about the dismantling of old system, it's the dismantling of a hope to have a universal system. So that never existed in countries like Brazil, like an important system of social housing protection and promotion. So there is also this Global South version, and we can see that very clearly in in the peripheries of capital, for instance, in Chile, in Mexico, in Brazil, in South Africa, which was basically massive production of new homes in the outskirts. But when I'm talking about outskirts and suburbs, I'm talking about to build thousands of low-income homes without any commercial space, without transportation, without proper infrastructure, without any urban life outside of the city and in these suburbs. And the mechanism by which all this process was able to be implemented was through strong state subsidies. So basically the model that was invented in Chile, Chile was the neoliberal laboratory for that in the 70s, together with UK and US. And the model in Chile was basically private developers, they offer their products in the very, very far away middle of nowhere peripheries, and the state provide subsidies for the people to buy those apartments there. And of course, people bought their apartments because they had no other choice. So the fact that the implementation of the policy meant the destruction of other alternatives. In the case of US, of UK, was the destruction of council housing or social housing. Destruction physically meant demolitions in many, many cases, but destruction culturally as something that was not aimed for, residual, and the home of the failure of the people who are not able to have a proper home. And of course, this has as well a racialized bias in it, especially if you take the social housing experience in the US. Was very clear that that US had always a double system of housing, one providing home ownership through mortgages and the securitization of mortgages, and that was able to build all the suburbanization of US cities, but at the same time public housing in the inner areas to be managed by public companies and rented to the working class. And the working class that initially was living there moved into the suburbs in the 40s and 50s, and then a new group of immigrants, of Afro-American migrants, and then Latino migrants came to live in those housing projects that became basically non-white places, identified as places for crime, and that process, together with cutting the funds to maintain those housing projects, had, of course, degraded physically the material conditions of those places, and then you create the bedrock of seeing this is a blight, degraded place, a ghetto, we should demolish and get rid of it. So that was the mechanism in the case of US, but in the case of Chile or Brazil or South Africa, that was a powerful mechanism to get rid of the self-built areas, the campamentos or the favelas in the case of Brazil that were very well located. So this housing policy that offers housing in the middle of nowhere is also an urban mechanism in order to clean up well-located place in order from poor people, from low-income communities, dispossess them, and of course, in the case of Chile, that had also a very important political importance under Pinochet, because campamentos were the socialist base for Pinochet. And in the case of Chile, for Santiago, for instance, it was really, really total dismantling of campamentos and then resettling the people in the outskirts, where a lot of social problems now occur. We have also different forms of financialization of housing. Sometimes you talk, oh, this is not financialization because we don't have global investors here. There is no global investors. And I hear eventually this type of narrative in some places. But the question is not if the financial capital is internal or external, is global or is not global. The question is the financialized behavior. And when councils and the public sector and public companies became financialized as well, so that was the triumph of the model, because that shifts completely the directions of planning and urban from being based on the needs of the people towards the needs of invested capital to have yields. And the mantra, the slogan of that was, and it's a famous World Bank book that was disseminated, or that unlock land value. So how come a very valuable asset believed by a neighborhood, a low-income neighborhood? So unlock land value means get rid of this poor from here, and let's offer this chunk of land to financial investors. So we are talking about the process of geographic restructuring, and we are talking about expansion of borders. We are talking about the mobilization of this surplus capital, which is floating around the planet. And of course, this process is not new. So the whole theory of spatial fix, so how much, when you have excess of capital, the best thing to do is either you do a war or you build a city or a new infrastructure in order to burn this excess of capital, but also to open a new field for capital productivity. So it's not new. Even Paris reform under Haussmann was a kind of a spatial fix, and finance is always related to build space. So what's new? The new is, first of all, the scale. It's a new scale, because there is no barriers from surplus capital to move from one place to other, so you have much more money circulating and in hunger for assets. The second new thing is digital economy. So what digital economy does in terms of this new moment is that it makes it much more easy and rapid. So it's just a bit. In a bit, you can bankrupt the country. Very easy. You just take out all the money that is there from one day to the other. But also, what is new, and it's very important in order to understand that, is titlerization. So how the built space became a very integral part of the financialization circuit. The titlerization means that something which is very fixed, a building, very tectonic, very rooted, in Spanish even real estate, the translation for real estate in Spanish is bienes raíces, which means goods with roots. So, deeply rooted. I mean, how can you transform something that is deeply rooted and fixed and material into abstract fiction circuits? This is the thing. And the thing is that was possible through new instruments of titlerization, like real estate investment trusts, for instance. Instruments, new financial instruments that made possible for capital to get in and get out without all the transaction costs of changing property rights. So it's a title that represents access to that place, represents access to the interest that comes to extract value from that place without really being the owner of that place. So titlerization made possible a total new animal, which is the real estate financial complex, in the words of Manuel Albers, which is not exactly real estate, not exactly finance. It's a combination of both. And this is very important because the old way of dealing and seeing built space is like something that is deeply rooted and related to some forms of use, of functions. So now this is not important anymore because for the financial circuit, built spaces are assets. So they are assets written on the books. And the assets make possible for for investors in general to leverage more capital and more money. I mean, this is very empirical for all of us. When we need a loan in the bank, we go to the bank, we ask the manager, please, can you provide me a loan? And then the first question that the manager asks is, do you have any apartment, house to provide as collateral? So it's very important, built space is very important as collateral. And why is important as collateral? Because if you don't pay back the loan, then the bank can sell your home or your property or your piece of land and get again the money. So built space and space in general has a very important role as collateral that provides leverage. But then put that on scale, like huge investment funds that can use huge property as collateral to leverage more. And this, as collateral and as asset, the buildings don't need even to be used. They can be empty for many, many years. So I can tell you the story that I was traveling to Indonesia, I think, and I stopped over Dubai, and I was seeing all those tall buildings, and all of them empty. And by the time I was very ignorant, and I thought, poor developer. He must have really, really lost his money because he was not able to sell those things. Those things are there and nobody's using them. No. Assets can be on the books and not be used and mobilized because most of the investors in real estate, insurance companies, pension funds, sovereign funds, they need this value in the long run, not immediately. So even if it's not now, it's okay. And since it's very rapid, changing hands, and I have seen in Sweden, for instance, a social housing company that was sold to 14 different investment managers in the last 5 years. And from one to the other, they were not interested in social housing. They were interested in the amount of money that they were able to extract in any transaction from one to the other. So we are talking about a competition between us, poor mortals, looking for a place to live and willing to pay something for this place to live. We are competing with those players in the housing market, and more than that, with the active and complicit action of our states and governments that are not protecting us, are protecting them. That's the state of things. And I would say that the first wave of financialization, which I described a little bit, including in the Global South, was related to home ownership, to the promotion of home ownership. But now we are witnessing a second wave of financialization. After the financial crisis, then when it became clear that the promise that everybody will have a property where everybody will own his own flat became really something that was not fulfilled, then instead of reforming the whole policy of housing, and I'm talking about the places where the financial crisis really burst hard, like the US and Spain, among others, the new wave is rental housing. So what happened is the same groups and investment funds started to buy the foreclosured homes in the US, the ones that were empty without anybody living in, but also in Ireland and also in Spain, becoming global corporate landlords, which was something that UK government was actively aiming and promoting to attract to UK, saying we need a professionally run rental sector who can be able to provide rent and rental housing schemes for most of the people. So what happens with this entry of these global landlords together with digital platforms and the digital revolution on managing those housing is that, of course, they enter into the market to maximize profitability and to unlock housing wealth. So again, what is happening is that much more evictions are happening more and more in the places where those actors are there. And that, again, true, for instance, in Sweden and Germany, they created a new word to define that, is renoviction. Renoviction means to renew the public housing, the housing that was not properly maintained for many, many years because of the cuts in the budget and all that. And with the renewal, since there are still in places means and laws to regulate rent, so through renewal, it's a bypass in order to raise the rents and occasionally to evict people. But also with a lot of means like harassment, pressure, and many, many stories that are being told about that. So this new wave of housing, this new wave of financialization of housing through rental schemes that I can elaborate a little more afterwards if you have questions, is also arriving and coming to the Global South. So after all the criticism of home ownership as the one and only model, and after the collapse of home ownership provision, then comes all the actors again, the World Bank, the International Development Bank, the International Asian Bank said, oh no, let's diversify tenure and let's have rental housing. And rental housing, again, not exactly based on the people's needs and capacities, but based on the expectation of profitability. And the same investment funds and the same financial actors that had created and generated the financial crisis in the first time, like JP Morgan, among the others, are the ones who are creating these new big enterprises that are in rental housing right now. If you take Blackstone or BlackRock, those big, or Vonovia, those giants that have now, like, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of units, monopolizing units, monopolizing and then setting the rent prices of entire neighborhoods, they, inside them, is the same logic, is the same money. I can't finish my talk. If I finish my talk like that, I think that everybody will just jump out of the window and said, oh my God, what are we going to do? I mean, so powerful, so global, and so widely adopted everywhere. What can I do? So it's very important to understand that the implementation of this model does not occur without political and social battles and several forms of resistance. Resistance to prevent mega developments that are occurring in the cities, and also to resist to stay put, to resist against rent rises. So what we are seeing everywhere is a new wave of housing social movements. Everywhere. A new wave of housing social movements that also, again, are very different from place to place. So here in the UK, for instance, as well as in Spain, we are seeing the rising of tenants' union and tenants' mobilization. Same thing in the US. And some other places, there are a very strong movement for social housing again and for social housing building again. So we see different places. In the case of São Paulo, my own city, squattering empty buildings, an important part of the city has been and is already one of the most important measures and tactics and strategies of resistance. So we are talking about a process of displacement versus a process of emplacement. Emplacement means community building, means creating landscapes for life and not landscapes for rent. And that can mean many different things in many different places. Can mean squattering and occupation of public and private space. And public land and public buildings are absolutely crucial to this strategy, because it's about time to end with the idea that public spaces are private property of the governments. Public spaces are our common property of the citizens. So a lot of movements claiming those common spaces and trying to commoning what is common is also a race. They have sometimes very small duration, sometimes they have a very long duration, but I know that they are not hegemonic, that they were not being able up to now to transform completely the way housing is being proposed and the way housing is being, what is the dominant narrative of housing, but I think they are a very powerful prefiguration of alternative ways of organizing collective life. Not only a tactic to demand from the state, but also the constructions of counter spaces, of contested spaces. And so every space which is taken out from the playground offered to the financial capital today is a place of resistance, and it's very meaningful and very important. Thank you.